Welcome back. We're starting to dive deeper and deeper into chapter 8. We're getting ready to kick off the third component. And want to talk for a few minutes about just changes in aggregate demand. Why those, what causes the changes, what are demand shifters? We talked about demand shifters and supply shifters when we were talking about individual market economies. And aggregate demand has demand shifters too, as you would expect it to. And again, when we looked at the four components that drive aggregate demand, and the four components that the things that cause that aggregate demand curve to slope downward, we're still looking at the changes in aggregate demand at those four components that drive it. We're talking about consumption, talking about investment, talking about government purchases. Again, when we're talking about government purchases, we don't want to get confused when we're talking about the 50+% of government spending that goes to transfer payments, Medicaid, Social Security, those type payments. So when you're looking at government purchases, again, you're talking about items for the military. You're talking about items for space exploration. You're talking about improvements in infrastructure, within the United States. So what we're looking at is, as far as changes in demand, we want to talk about, and basically it's a change in any component, again, consumption, investment, government purchases, net exports, other than the price level, that causes that aggregate demand curve to either increase, shift outward to the right, or decrease and contract and come back in on the left. What is causing that graphical representation of aggregate demand to shift one way or another, as long as it's not the price level? Because at that point, as it shifts, you're talking about increased demand or decreased demand at all price levels, not just individual price levels. So what we talk about is when we look at, whether it's consumption, investment, net export, government purchases, those are going to become our demand shifters. What happens if there's a change in one of those? What happens to the aggregate demand curve? Is it shifting out to the right? Is it shifting downward to the left? And we'll just kind of tick them off, kind of one at a time. And so let's talk a few minutes about the first one, the big C. We're talking about consumptions. And any change in consumption spending at a given price level is going to cause that demand curve to shift out. And changes in consumption, especially personal consumption. Think about yourselves. What drives your personal consumption decisions? One thing is just consumer confidence. If you listen to the talking heads and you listen to the surveys, and the American population at this point in time may not have the most confidence in what the policy makers are deciding. Is it President Biden's fault? Is it the policy makers within the Senate, the House of Representatives? We don't really know what's driving the decisions, and some of them are pretty unique decisions. What drives those decisions, and because we're having trouble with what's driving those decisions, it's eroding our confidence level with the economy, just the state of the economy as a whole. Even though inflation rates and the price level, seems to be somewhat dropping now, but they were pretty much out of control in 2021 and 2022. So we're still trying to build back that confidence level. And if you think about it, if the confidence level goes up, what's that going to happen? And when we talk about goods and services now, on aggregate now, we're probably more talking about durable goods, automobiles, appliances for the home, things that last multiple years. If you think about tax law and stuff, let's say you've got some rental property and you need to replace the appliances in your rental property, or you need to replace appliances in your home. What are you going to go out and buy a new range, a new cooktop, a new refrigerator, or do you try to limp along with that old one because you're not really sure what the future is going to look like, and it's right now it's eroding your confidence. So, as the confidence goes up, you see purchases of durable goods go up, and likewise as the confidence goes down, which it's impacting that with a lot of individuals now, you're going to see a downward trend in purchasing of those durable goods. And it's going to, depending on your confidence level, it's going to, the confidence level of, the majority of the individuals within the United States, it's going to, or any nation for that matter, it's going to cause those, aggregate demand curves, to shift either to the right or to the left. Another thing is taxes. And when we're talking now taxes, we're talking about more along the lines of, either personal income tax or, capital gains tax. And we'll talk about some of that a little later too. But as you get a decrease in taxes, you're going to get an increase in, typically an increase in consumption. Decrease in taxes, people have more disposable income. I have a son that's, lived in, when he first got out of graduate school, he lived in LA, and, LA is just, the tax base in LA just pretty much sucks the life out of you. But, he lived and worked in LA for a while. Then he moved to Texas, and, he, kind of like say he died and gone to heaven, because not only did he get a bump up in, in his gross income, but he got a bump up in his disposable income, because there's no state income tax in the state of Texas. So he wasn't getting drained of disposable income like he was in California. So he thought life was great in Texas, and now he's moved to Tennessee, and he's in a similar situation in Tennessee where there's no state income tax. So individuals that are concerned about tax base, they're probably not going to be living in California. They're probably not going to be living in the state of New York either. And so a lot of people will actually look for states like Nevada, Washington State, Florida, Texas, Tennessee. I think there's 7 states in the United States. Maybe one of the Dakotas has no state income tax, but they're looking at areas where either there's no state income tax, or they're looking at areas where there's lower state income tax to move to and actually work, because that's what's going to drive your disposable income. So again, depending on how the tax rates impact your income, if you decrease the overall tax rate, it's going to increase your disposable income, and it's going to increase your confidence level in spending. So pretty straightforward on taxes. And there's a couple of ways that you see taxes working. It's, does the government decide, if they want to boost, let's say the government wants to boost aggregate demand, they may lower the personal income tax rate. They may, give a tax rebate. There have been instances in the past where the government doles out money and they call it a rebate, hoping to bump up, consumer spending. Hadn't been that long ago that there were some tax rebates passed out by Uncle Sam. And you've also got, transfer payments. Think about the transfer payments. What happens when transfer payments to Medicaid recipients, or transfer payments in the form of your Social Security benefits? What happens to that when you get this big bump increase? Hopefully you hope it's long-term, but the tax rebate is more of a temporary short-term fix. But a bump up in your Social Security payment, it's going to typically bump up consumption. So that's so you've got, things impacting consumption. You've got, what's consumer confidence. You've got what's going on with taxes, changes in investments. You think about people, and it's not only in the stock market that people are concerned about the future, but think about what it's going to do with investments. If you've got a confidence in what the market's going to do, it's going to confidence expectations. It's going to determine, as we talked about a little earlier, I guess in segment 2, it's going to boost potentially income investment. You may decide that you want to buy maybe a something that you've got some kind of little business going on, and you want to buy some individual items to go in that little business, or it's just going to help you determine, do I need to make that purchase now, or do I need to wait 6 months and make that purchase? Do I think the policymakers, the quote experts in Washington, can help turn this economy around and get us moving in the right direction? So that's what's going to happen there. So and then it gets when it gets to investment. So we've gone to kind of the personal consumption piece. Let's move into the investment arena, where we're talking about your local Starbucks, where you're talking about Meharry Medical Center. You may be talking about a new restaurant in Nashville that's opening up. Think about all those country music bars that have popped up in downtown Nashville. Think about manufacturing and, just in Tennessee in general. And you have all of these individuals where you're looking at investments. You're looking at, the capital stock, what can they do to improve profit margins? What do they think things are going to look like in the long run? Do they think their product that they are manufacturing, or the product, what do they think sales are going to be in the future? And that's going to help shift that aggregate demand curve up and down, because now you're looking at changes in investments. Do I as a business owner invest now, or do I wait 6 months to invest and lose some valuable time in getting new products to market? Because when you're running a business, it's, what does that speed to market look like? What is that time factor to get your product to market and to grab your share of that market economy? So that's what's going to really impact your confidence, your expectation, and your capital expenditures for investments. Same thing with individuals buying houses. What is that? What do you think the future is going to look like? And as far as when it comes to the investment, so we talked about consumption. Now we're getting into investment, and like consumption, you've also got things like tax policy. You've got, if you think about, we talked about in one of the previous chapters, you've got sole proprietor, you've got partnership, and they are going to be, profits are going to be taxed at the personal tax level. You've got an LLC, which you don't have the liability exposure like you do with sole proprietor or partnership. And you also, so you've got some, some protection there, and it's still being taxed to you at the personal tax rate. It's when you move into that corporate sphere that you're starting, as we talked about earlier, you're talking about in that corporate America, that corporate sphere, you're being double taxed. You're being taxed on profits at the corporate level. You're being taxed on, if you own stock in that corporation, you're being taxed on that as once you get, assuming that the corporation distributes its profits, if it keeps it as retained earnings, it's a little different. But if it distributes its profits as dividends, you're going to get dinged again. You're going to get, the government's going to be great for them, because they're going to be siphoning tax dollars off 2 different ways. Corporate profits going to be taxed, and they're going to turn around and ding you with a personal tax. So, and just remember that when you're talking about, especially if you own stock, or when you go to sell, or when you go to sell a business, there's going to be some tax implications on capital gains. And so capital gains tax typically haven't changed over the last few years. The government may lower the personal tax, but they haven't done much to touch capital gains tax. Now, there was I think in the Trump administration, they lowered, seems like they did lower the corporate tax rate on profits to help boost the economy. So there's some things that they can do with tax policy to help shift that aggregate demand out. Or, if they need to shift it downward, they can turn around and start playing around with those corporate tax rates. They can start playing around with the capital gains tax rates, and they can essentially start playing around with the personal tax rates, which kind of goes back to the personal consumption. Interest rates, again, we've talked about that. As interest rates go up, the cost of money goes up, and typically investment in capital stock goes down. And when we're talking about interest rates, there's two types of cost of money. It's the cost of the money if you're going to borrow it to make capital investments, but there's also a cost of money that some people forget about. If you've got cash in your pocket and you're going to use your own cash to make that investment, there's also a cost to using that money, because you could have taken, again, what's the opportunity cost? Go back to the opportunity cost of it. What's the cost to you of investing that money in some kind of a financial institution or loaning that money out to somebody else? So that's kind of covered we've got the consumption, shifting the aggregate demand schedule either in or out. We've got the investment piece, shifting it either in or out. Now we fall down to, good old Uncle Sam. And if you think about Uncle Sam, what entity has any more impact on not only GDP or real GDP, or any more impact on shifting the aggregate demand curve either in or out than government purchases, other than individual consumption? Individual consumers are going to shift the majority of it, but Uncle Sam's going to fall in there second. So Uncle Sam can decide based on if they want to boost the economy, if they think it's a little sluggish, they can increase government purchases and push that puppy out a little. If they think the economy is overheating and moving too quickly, they can cut back on government purchases. And it's probably easier for the government to do to impact their spending patterns maybe than it is individually than it is in the investment community on capital stocks and residential stock, and maybe a little easier to do with consumer spending, because sometimes personal consumption, it's a little slow to react. So you've gone through now consumption, you've gone through investments, you've gone through government purchases, and now we're going to talk about changes in exports. And again, what are we looking at when we talk about net exports? We're talking about increases in net exports, going to push that aggregate demand out. Decreases in net exports is going to bring it back in. And what happens on net exports is, to get to the net export level that you need, that a nation needs to be functioning within, or functioning at, I hate to use the term at, but anyway, it's exports minus imports get you to your net exports. So you're talking about a change in net exports at each price level. And so what happens, it's like all of the other factors. If net exports go up, aggregate demand shifts out. Net exports come down, aggregate demand contracts or shifts back in. So now we're looking at things like income abroad. What happens if the income abroad all of a sudden increases? What happens if individuals in France get a big bump in pay, or individuals in Australia get a big bump in pay, and they have a taste for Kentucky bourbon. So all of a sudden now they get this big bump in pay, and it's going to shift that aggregate demand out for not only bourbon but other products that we generate here in the United States. It's going to increase that net export, because depending on how the economy is in a foreign country, it's going to adjust their income level and again adjust their perception of wealth. And so if they think they are wealthier and better off, they're going to start looking at some of our exports And if so, as it increases income in a foreign country, that's going to increase the demand for exports. We did see an impact in, where we're talking about income changes abroad. Look what happened with COVID. Not only did COVID impact the United States, but think of all of the other countries, especially Italy as an example. Think of what happened to these other countries and the impact of COVID and the impact of what COVID had on not only the economy of these countries, but the individual income levels of individuals that lived in those countries. So just keep in mind, it's not just, the income effect here in the United States. What's the income effect in other countries that are going to impact net exports? Think about exchange rates. What's going to happen? Exchange rates go up in the United States. That means, we can buy more. Typically when exchange rates go up in the United States, compared to the exchange rates or the value of currency in foreign countries, then, typically see net exports start to go down. And so, typically what you see is when the exchange rate bumps up in a country, exports go down, but imports go up, and that's going to drive that net exports in the wrong direction. And again, what we're talking about in foreign countries, you're talking about foreign price levels and you're talking about foreign income. So as foreign price levels go up, you typically think that as the price levels go up there, you typically think that you're going to get a bump in exports and you're going to get a decrease in imports. So just think about all of these impacts. Not only it's sometimes as a macroeconomist, you can tend to get lost in putting on your blinders and just thinking about the United States. Think about other countries. What's going on in other countries? And if you're listening to just the talking heads in the United States, you might not keep up with what's going on in other countries. So as a consumer, and it doesn't matter whether you're in business for yourself or you're a college student, just be aware of not only what's going on with price level and real GDP in the United States, but be aware of what's going on outside of the boundaries of the United States, because that's going to impact what's going to happen to that aggregate demand. What's going to happen is that aggregate demand curve going to shift out to the right, or is it going to fall back to the left? And then the last thing, and it's kind of a thing that bumps up against exports, and maybe people don't think too much about it, is, you've got things like tariffs and quotas and, domestic content requirements that no matter what these other impacts of net exports are, they can just put a damper on everything. So think about, tariffs, and think about the import quotas or the tariffs that are put on French wines coming in. You have people complaining about that, or tariffs and quotas and, embargoes. The United States, puts, limits on what, we can buy from China. China gets all upset. They put, limits on what they can buy from the United States. So no matter how the workings of the consumption and investment and government purchases and net exports are, all of that can be impacted by countries' policy decisions when it comes to tariffs and quotas and, content and that type of thing. So just again, I can't stress enough, don't just put your blinders on and think about what's going on in the United States. Be thinking about what's going on, globally. What does the global market look like? And I think it will position you to be more successful in your personal, your professional career, but also it's going to give you a leg up on your personal life and how you make those personal consumption decisions. And then the last thing they talk about in that, in this kind of piece of the chapter, or this, segment that we're talking about right now, is they talk about a multiplier. And the multiplier, because every transaction has a buyer and a seller. And the impact of those transactions, the overall impact of those transactions may be greater than the initial impact of that transaction. So what they've done is they provided you a little formula that talks about the multiplier, and that formula on the multiplier is basically real GDP demanded at each price level divided by the initial change in aggregate demand. So that's the formula that you've got. And again, like most mathematical formulas, you can rearrange terms, and you've got the multiplier times the initial change in aggregate demand is actually equal to the change in real GDP demand at each price level. And again, if you know two of those variables, you can figure out what the third one is. And one just kind of last tidbit to throw in, those of you that are college students and those of you that are into the Greek social life on any college campus, the Greek, whether it's fraternity or sorority, they're all into the Greek alphabet, and and I'm sure that everybody's had to take and recite the Greek alphabet. And so the multiplier, when economists love talking about change and drawing the little triangle. And so if you remember the little triangle, it's in the Greek, talking about delta. And it's talking about, it's a capital letter, the Greek alphabet, that talks about the change in. So you're talking about the change in real GDP demand at each price level divided by the initial change in aggregate demand. So kind of like we talked about omega in one of the on one of the earlier chapters. Now we're talking about delta. We're talking about the change in. So that's going to kind of bring us up to a stopping point now, because in the next segment, here's where this chapter is trying to tie the first 7 chapters together, and things get a little complicated as you go through this chapter 8. So we're going to get into aggregate demand, aggregate supply. We're starting to look at the long run, starting to look at the short run. And it's, it'll get a little complicated, but we'll try to just bear with me as I try to explain this going forward. And it's going to, the first 8 chapters of this text is going to position you fairly well to understand a lot of the underpinnings and a lot of the complexities of kind of the macroeconomic world that we live in. So be back in a few minutes, and we'll kind of jump into aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and try to figure out what they mean by short run and long run. Talk to you in a few.